everyone, and thank you for joining me for another Women's Spotlight. Today, you'll notice I'm in a different background. I'm in my little brother's house, but I did not want to miss my time with Kristen, as she's extremely busy doing amazing things out there. She is got amazing history. She's been helping in the tech industry, advertising and marketing industry for over 15 years before she decided to make a bit of a change and jump out there and help women become the best that they can be in their own journey, especially tech women, because we know how hard it is to show up authentically as a woman in tech. So without further ado, Kristen, thank you so much for joining us to talk to us about all of your experience today.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. So you'll notice that my throat's a little strained, but we'll make this work, Kristen. So when you agreed to be on the podcast, I was super excited because I heard you at the Women in Tech Global Conference, and I thought you were very inspiring. I love the way how you use your improv fun, curiosity to come and bring it to such a rigid type of career like Women in Tech. And now being able to step outside of both and merge them and help women step into the next level is really exciting. And I want to applaud you for your work.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So let's start with how this journey even unfolded. I mean, you've worked at companies such as Yahoo, Verizon, like you've worked with some of the biggest of the biggest, and then you've also worked with some startups. So tell us about how you went through the motion between smaller companies and some of these large conglomerates. Let's start there.
Absolutely. So I started my career on the advertising side, specifically at like an agency that did digital marketing, which was funny because when I was graduating from college, there was no coursework on that yet. It was a job that didn't exist when I started college, pretty much. So I went into this really dynamic new industry at that time. And it turned out that it was a really fast growing media team, also a lot of turnover because advertising agencies tend to burn people out very quickly. So it tends to be a lot of younger people and then a lot of turnover. So we had the team I worked on was like 30 something people, and there was a lot of need for management. So I was promoted into my first management role when I was maybe 25. So it was pretty early into my career, and I was lucky enough to have a couple great mentors who really made an impact at that point. But that got me into management, and I realized that developing my people, like helping them with their careers, was really the most satisfying part of my work. So that kind of carried through from there. I only wanted to take on leadership roles, ideally, because that was giving me so much of the fulfillment. It wasn't necessarily advertising in itself. That was fulfilling me.
So when you joined advertising, what was in your mind? Like, did you think, I'm going to go out there and I just love marketing a brand? Did you think I want to do this to connect with people? Was it something your parents suggested? How did you get into advertising prior to being 25 and being promoted into leadership?
So I was like a business major, and we would choose a concentration, and marketing had always kind of been the most appealing to me. I'm like, oh, it's fun, it's got data, and it's got a creative side, which kind of sums up me. And I thought it would be cool, but I saw myself going down like a brand manager career path, like a CPG, like brand manager path, where you end up getting an MBA, and it's like a pretty structured career path. Because what I ended up doing I had no idea it existed at that point. So it ended up being like, instead of this really structured path, it was like, hey, there's a lot of opportunities here if you're up for them, and you can accelerate very quickly, very early in your career, just because of digital marketing and how new it was and just how dynamic it was.
So you're in school, you're doing your business degree, you join marketing, you think I'm going to be a brand manager one day and talk about all of the great brands. Hi, see you this, and then teach it to everyone else. And instead, you got into leadership and you fell in love. What about leadership grabbed your heart and intoxicated you?
So it was a few things. I think the one-on-one piece I really thrive on. Like anytime I've done like Gallup Strengths Finder, for example, my top one is relationships. I love working with people one-on-one. So part of that is really like the ability to coach and mentor and guide my more junior employees, which is something I found really fulfilling. I really aligns with my values, which of course leads to why I do what I do now. But it really was fulfilling in a way that I hadn't necessarily anticipated before that, because I didn't even really know what it meant to manage people. So I really loved that.
And when you were in management, and throughout the course of your life in management, because 25 is when you really started and you've grown through several organizations and advanced your leadership titles. As you were connecting in, what is it that you could look to or draw to from those around you that really speaks most loudly to you? And what I mean by that, like moving from marketing or from branding into marketing into tech, did you see the faces and the concepts of leaders around you shift, like more females or males or more structured, less structured? Anything that you can that you observe that you can share with us?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's changed a lot throughout my career. Because on the advertising side, it was pretty equal, I would say. There were more, as far as like senior management, I think there were more men than women, but there were a couple like really good role models for me, as women who were, maybe 15, 20 years into their career at that point, and were really good role models for like, oh, okay, this is a path that I could go down. So I think having the role models was really key. It got a lot more challenging when I moved into a tech startup, and it was very small. It was like 12 people, but it was basically me and maybe one other woman the whole time, and just me for a bit as well. And otherwise all men, which is pretty typical as far as tech startups go. But it was a little bit jarring to go from a relatively equally represented leadership environment with good role models for me to that.
Yes. And you talked a little bit about mentors early on and people who helped guide that journey. I'm going to come back to that. But first, I want to start with, as you went through that unfolding of being an equal balance or somewhat similar to becoming one of two in the room, is there anything that you recognize that came up for you that either made you feel that you had to present differently than you were, or behave inauthentically, or try and follow the mold? And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm just giving you some examples. Or did you feel like, no, you know what, as a woman, I'm a kick-ass, badass woman, and I'm showing up and I feel great being how I am? Like, how did that happen and unfold for you?
It was definitely not the latter. There was a lot more struggle in there. Yeah, I didn't have at that point. I was like maybe 5 or 6 years into my career, and I had been in an environment where I was really supported. I think I'd been promoted like 4 times at that point in like 5 or 6 years. So and I had a lot of great managers throughout that journey. I felt like I was appreciated, but I had just kind of maxed out like what I wanted to do. I was really eager, living in San Francisco, I was really eager to go the startup route. And, there are all these appealing stories of like, oh, you get in at the right time. And this was right around when Lean In came out. And it's like that, get on the rocket ship. So I was like, I want to get on a rocket ship, which I did not. But that was the perspective I was coming from at that point. And I was like, I'm ready to work super hard. I, negotiated a director title for it. I was like, I want this going in. And I was really proud of myself for that. But when it actually came to getting into it, it was such a different environment. And there were so many expectations put on me that weren't actually clear to me. There's a lot of things that were not what I expected. And it got to a point where I was working so many hours, like, 80-hour weeks, and I was not getting any support from that culture. And I had wanted so badly to believe that like everything I'd heard about the impact of gender and tech leadership like was overhyped or whatnot. Like I wanted to believe that. Like I just like wanted to like believe the best in people, but that ended up not really being the case. It was very difficult.
And what I've come to experience is that people aren't doing this intentionally. It's when we look at any majority, whether it's by race or creed or sexuality or sexual preference or any majority, what tends to happen is we emulate the majority to continue to have success within that environment. And so it sounds like everyone around was getting on that bandwagon. You were fighting for a seat at the table. And is it fair to say maybe you didn't know you could build your own table, or you could do it differently than what they were doing? Or had you tried to do it differently and you got shut down? Just curious about that.
Yeah, it was quite a journey. There were a few different things. Because when I first came in, I really felt like I had a seat at the table and I was so excited about it. I was like, this is what I want. I want to be like on the ground with this company, like informing their strategy for around like client success and ad operations and all of that. Like I was very excited about it. And I came into it like ready to grab it. But at some point I was just getting feedback that didn't really make sense to me. And my role kind of kept changing. And then I started there were all of these problems with the product and such that are in with the revenue of the company that then started getting blamed on me. And I wish I had the confidence to look back at it, or at that time, I wish I had the confidence to be like, wait, this is not okay. This is actually a really not a good work environment for me and I need to just leave. But I took it very, very personally. And it was the darkest time of my career, honestly, was dealing with both the shock from having like a good, like the place, like where I started my work, it was like the perfect place to launch my career. So jumping like from that, a startup environment, and then feeling like I was having all of this blame placed on me, I took it like very seriously. I was like, oh, well, you know what? Maybe I'm not as good at this as I thought it was. Like maybe I thought I was a rock star and I'm not really a rock star.
And so you start to internalize and you start to have limiting beliefs that come up from the past that are triggered, I'm assuming. Correct me if I'm wrong. And then that snowballs because you take the criticism and you own it on your chest, and you shrink, but you're trying to do more, but you're starting to doubt your capabilities, which means you take less risky moves as a leader, and then it impacts you. At least I shouldn't say you, I've seen that happen. And that's what, when you're explaining it to me, is rolling out in my mind. So now you're in this situation where it's getting worse. You don't know how to bring back that joy and that power that you had when you first started, and things are being blamed on you. How did you break out of that, or did you?
There was kind of a breaking point. And for me, it was when for one thing, I had gotten into a place of depression at that point and started to treat that, like definitely like situationally caused. And I was like sitting in my car one afternoon, like after like driving back from work, and I was just crying in my car for like probably an hour because I don't even remember what this particular situation was, but it was a breaking point. It's a lot of the same stuff that had been happening, like a very like toxic culture and a lot of stuff being put on me that I didn't have the confidence at the time to be able to stand up to. And I just kind of had this realization where I was like, this is not okay. Why am I in this situation? And that combined with having like conversations with like other people in my life who were kind of like opening my eyes to like this, maybe you're not the problem. Because I was just taking all of that on. And like, if people are giving me like negative feedback, it must be me. Like and whereas this point, it's much easier to say like, okay, well, feedback is it's a data point. Like one person's feedback is just a data point. It might be an important data point if it's your manager, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's the story of your behavior and your strengths and weaknesses. But at the time, that was my whole world. I was like, oh, like I've been so validated by all this like external feedback and getting recognized that when it was a very different situation from that, it just crushed me.
You came in on this high, you started working for them, it was great. Then slowly it started to chip away. You had to start to present yourself inauthentically or different than how you were. You were starting to be blamed for things that weren't actually yours. And you came to the breaking point where it's like, I just got to cry, I got to release. And now something's going on where I'm feeling, hold on, this is not normal. And I am taking who I am and I'm associating it to what I do and what I achieve. And so without that achievement, who's Kristen? Am I still good enough? Am I still worthy? Am I supposed to even have a seat at this table that I've worked so hard for? And so you started calling friends. And is this where mentors came in to help you as well? Or how did you make the shift away from that finally to just saying, that's it, I choose me over this?
Yeah, it was a number of like mostly conversations with friends, and like my mom and my dad were like good influences with that too. And yes. And just doing reading, and also like around that time I was getting involved with a like professional women's networking organization that was like basically for millennial women. So I ended up co-leading the San Francisco chapter of that down the road, but I was starting to get more and more exposure to like really awesome women who are doing great things. And we were having these conversations, like we were doing like book clubs with business clubs, and particularly around like women leaders. And I was starting to see more and more stuff that like, okay, like this is something that I can come forward to versus just being in this place where I was just taking in all this feedback and frozen, like kind of like you said, like I didn't really know how to move forward. So with all of that kind of influence combined, I was able to get out of that, and honestly some therapy too. I had started around that.
That's great.
Yeah, I was able, and then but it was one of those things like it was once it was clear to me, like it was like the lens defogging. Yeah. And you're like, oh, what I thought was happening was not at all what was happening. Like once it was clear looking back, it was so much more obvious to me. But so I thought, so actually that was a really, really important growth thing, as much as not fun as it was. It really taught me that your work is not your identity. Like you're more than just your work. And one person's feedback is not everything.
100%. And so how did you end up getting into coaching? Because coaching and developing, I mean, I can see how that darkness led to some growth and some big lessons. And it's always when we're on the other side of it that we see the value. When we're in the trenches and we're in the depression and we're in the darkness, it's really hard. But as soon as we're on the other side of it, we see it. Now, how did you grow from being on the other side of it, all these great networking events with these women, to deciding, I'm going to step up, be a coach, and help women elevate to the next level of their career?
Yeah. Well, there were several years in between, but there were like a few things that were happening. So I was, as I mentioned, co-leading the chapter for that organization, and we were doing several events a month, and that included, speaking in front of groups of people and just making a lot of great relationships. And even though I ended that role after a couple of years in, because just it was a little too much after a couple of years, I learned so much from it, and I met so many people, and it's kind of clicked in my brain like, oh, I really like facilitating like a workshop for people. Like I really like doing these events and being able to help people work through things. And I was kind of noticing that, like, even just among my friends, there was a lot of people who would go to me about like, how do you negotiate your salary and things like that nobody was teaching us. It was very much like, you've got to go out and seek this information on your own. And that was one clue that started me down that path. Another one was my dad was an entrepreneur. He was a small business, a coach and facilitator, and had his own business for 20 years. So I had that influence, and I knew kind of that could always be a path for me, which helps a lot because it's very scary to go out on your own, I will say. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that really just pieced it together was around that time I started doing improv. And I started it just as this completely random thing. I was at a point where I was just trying all these new things. I was not that long out of a relationship. Like, it was just one of those times in life. I was like, I'm just going to try things and see what happens. And I just fell in love with it. Like it was just so much fun that even though like it's objectively terrifying for most people to do something like that, and I was no exception, but I realized at some point that it was helping me like quiet the inner judge inside my brain, and it was helping me with being more present, and it was helping me like learn how to trust my instincts, which was so hard for me, because I wanted to overthink everything like, constantly. Mm-hmm. But like improv does so many things that just trains you out of that was really the missing puzzle piece for me, because before that I was like, oh, like I might create a business around this, but I don't really know what my angle would be. And then it was just like pieces just clicking into place where I was like, okay, I know from, trying to convince friends to come to a drop-in improv class at this point that a small percentage of the population is actually open to going to an improv class. The majority of people will just not do it. It's like their nightmare in living form. So I wanted to create a business where I'm kind of combining all of these, like all of my experience as a leader, especially like moving into the tech space, which was kind of like the second half of my career, and pulling in my like education. I got like a master's degree in management and leadership, and combining that with the improv piece to really help people build their confidence and ultimately just be empowered. Like it's just all about empowerment.
I love it. So the thing about improv for me is not only are you going out there and having fun and playing with curiosity, but you are literally throwing yourself out there in the moment, every moment, to be imperfectly perfect, which I always love for us to spend a little bit more time being playful with. So even if you're not going to join improv, have that mentality, play with yourself, even in the mirror where you're like, hey, what would I do in this situation? Because once you overcome that fear with the improv audience or with another audience where you're just kind of going at it with curiosity and you're taking the judgment out of the picture, then that's where your true power arises. So it sounds like for you, that was the final, block in the Lego pyramid that helped you really solidify the next move. And so how long have you been doing the coaching and the business leadership, helping tech leaders move to the next dimension? How long have you been doing that now?
So I am coming up on my 1 year of when I publicly launched my business, but it's been a little further back than that. It's probably been about like a year and 4 or 5 months or so.
Yeah.
The other piece of that, which I will say, because I said it's very scary to go out on your own. I think I needed a bit of a bump with it because I knew I wanted to do this. I got my master's degree. I was like, I knew what coaching credential I wanted, but I was having a really hard time doing it with a full-time job. I think especially I was a little burned out at that point. I'd been through a lot of changes with the company I was at, which was really like 4 companies in the time I was there. And I think I wasn't able to necessarily start it on the side while doing a full-time job. Like a lot of people can do that, and that's amazing. But for me, I think I needed a little bit of a push, and I was laid off. And for me, it ended up being like the perfect scenario because I was able to really take some time, recharge, and then just dive into my business. So
yeah, it sounds like a blessing. And, that's sometimes the thing that happens to us when we're in these turbulent situations. We don't know. We just don't know it's a blessing in disguise. So now you're in. Let's say you left on your own regardless, like a year in, are you loving what you do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely love it. It's funny because it's very difficult to start a business, which everybody says, but I feel like I can say that authoritatively now. And everybody kind of has their own path, but there is a lot of what I've described as like a fog metaphor, where maybe because I live in San Francisco and it's currently foggy, but
fair enough.
in August. But I like see it as this metaphor where you're moving forward and you like deep down, you're moving in the right direction, but you're not getting a lot of external signs that that's the case. Like you can't really see that far ahead of you. Every once in a while, you kind of see an outline of your sign. You're like, oh, I think I'm like on the right path. But really, like all you have to guide you at the end of it is like your own intuition. And well, it's scary to do that. I've always felt like I was doing what I'm supposed to be doing on this path. So that makes it a lot easier to get through the harder parts of it.
And finally, like as you're on the other end of it, you've also attracted your life partner. Tell us a little bit about that. Like you're getting married in like a week. That's so exciting.
Yeah, it was, I got engaged, I think 10 days after I officially launched my business. So it's been a lot of change in a relatively short period of time. But yeah, I met him online, and we weren't planning on getting into a relationship, but that's clearly here we are. And we really inspire each other. Like he's a leader in the senior living space and loves to nerd out on leadership development books, as do I. So that was one of the early things we bonded over, was talking about our favorite leadership books, which is very nerdy. And
I love it. So you'll be like hanging out in Lake Tahoe, getting married, talking about leadership skills and goals. Like, why not? It sounds amazing to me. So like the last thing I really want to talk about before we wrap up here is you talked a bit about burnout. And so you had that moment where you let the external voices get in, and you were having some situational depression that you worked through. But then you said, at the end, I had burnout. Like what were the symptoms of burnout for you? How did you manage it, and how did you move through it? Because so many women today are suffering from burnout.
mm-hmm. And burnout is not always what we think it looks like, is what I really discovered. Because it wasn't, for me, I'd experienced burnout in the crazy startup world, like working 80 hours a week, like kind of thing. Like that was what I associated with burnout. But I think for this case, it was just a lot of emotional upheaval personally. And it's also around like the pandemic when, many people have been experiencing this, and combined with a lot of change at work and not necessarily feeling as fulfilled in my role as I previously did, and a lot of reorgs and changes and mergers and acquisitions and company renaming and all of that. So I think it was a combination of factors. Like what I realized from it wasn't just a factor of like how many hours I was working. Like there was more to it than that.
And now that you're on the other end of it and you're coaching, if you were to coach someone who's going through the mergers and acquisitions, they're losing teammates, they're trying to bring new teammates on board, they still have a job to do as a leader. We still have to show up and we have to represent our team, we have to represent the client, and we have to represent our company, because we are not self-employed. We work for an organization. If you had to go back and coach someone like me, what would you tell me, or how would you not tell me because you're a coach, what would you guide me through on my journey to stay focused on through all of that burnout and all of that struggle? How could you perhaps help me stay connected, stay empowered, but not burn out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a lot of it really comes down to emotional intelligence, which is another one of my favorite topics because it ties in so much of the stuff that I talk about with improv. But that like awareness as the root is so important. Like when I have like a model where I use to like talk about improv principles, and the thing in the center is being present, because that you need to do before any of these other things can happen. So how that plays out in terms of like emotional intelligence and burnout is really that self-awareness piece. And it's not just being aware of how you're coming off to other people, or how people might be perceiving you. It's also being aware of what's happening inside you. Like, what emotions are you feeling? Like we used to just ignore emotions in the workplace. It's changed a lot in the last, decade or so, but it makes a huge impact. And if you aren't in touch with what's happening inside of you, it affects your ability to regulate at some point. So really having outlets for like ways to process your emotions, and outlets and a lot of like ways to take care of yourself so that you're going into these situations the best equipped that you can. It's hard. I'm far from perfect at getting a good night's sleep and exercising and all of that. But I think everybody kind of knows at least one or two things that make a huge difference in their ability to show up and be aware.
We do the best we can with what we have, but you said something, pretty critical, and that is that instead of just looking outward focused, we have to look inward. We have to understand ourselves, not just from a bodily perspective about, are we tired? Are we hungry? Are we feeling exhausted? But our cues, right? Like, what's our irritability like? How can we focus? How can we connect to that inner voice that is really telling us, what our compass is? And you talked a little bit earlier about values and understanding your value stream. Understanding your value stream also connects in there, right? Because like for me, I know like my 4 key values are contribution, loyalty, integrity, and love. And so when I feel like I can't come from a place of integrity, I know something's wrong and I'm burning out. Or if I feel like I can't contribute anymore, then I know my cup is empty. So I ask all of you at home to kind of, when you're thinking about burnout, it's different for everyone. But I would say one of the key indicators is when you don't feel connected to your inner self. Kristen, would you agree?
I absolutely agree. Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Awesome. So, wow, what a journey. You went through your school, you thought, I'm going to get my master's in business, or you did get your master's in business. You went out there, you were in advertising, you thought, I'm going to be a brand manager. You made a pivot. You became a very young leader at 25. You loved it. You worked your way up. You hit all the X's and dots and got all the stars. And then you said, I'm going to go work for a startup. And during that time, you went through some very big personal journeys. And on the other end of it, you realized what a blessing in disguise it was, because you learned, and now you can coach on those things. But at the time, you did struggle a bit, and as we all do with those tough moments. But you got out of it, you found yourself a great networking environment, you leveraged your mentors, you brought everyone together, and you used that fuel to move you forward while listening to those that really loved you, who said, hey, Kristen, this is not really you. Let's take a step back and see where we really want to be. And then you continued to progress your career forward until you found improv. And I think from what I've heard, improv gave you that next ability to go and be a warrior out there without being worried about how you were seen and being too over-prepared. You embraced it with curiosity and you said, hey, I'm going to just go with this. And you took that and all of your teachings and then another life-changing event, and you propelled yourself forward and started your own business. And then you met the man of your dreams, and now here you are talking to me and all of our listeners. What an exciting journey. But at the end of it, I want to know if you could go back and tell that little girl who's under 5 something, anything you'd like that you think would help your inner child on this journey, what would it be?
I think it would be that you are more than just what you accomplish. Because it's so easy to associate that, especially if you're a perfectionist or a high achiever personality, but really you are more than that.
I love it. Thank you. And for all of you out there listening, you are more than your total achievements as well. We live and work in a very high-paced environment, and sometimes it's important to take a step back, take care of ourselves, and understand that we're still giving love and amazing vibes without necessarily always being on the hamster wheel. Kristen, thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure all of our listeners do too. And we'd love to have you back again after you're married. Tell us about whatever next your chapters bring you. But thanks for coming today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for watching. Subscribe and follow me. And also, if you want some other content, hit me up on Tara Myshrall Speaks on Instagram, or join my inner circle at taramyshrall.com. You will be the first to receive new content when it drops, as well as the first to get the Women's Spotlight. Learn about other amazing women in our local community that are up to big things. Thanks again, with love and light. Until next time, guys.